We're talking about gathering lines in this room. You heard both Linda Doherty from PHMSA talk about it this morning. You heard me talk about it as a high priority. It's one of those things that we've noted because first we got hit up by a whole bunch of people in places like Fort Worth, Texas that had hundreds of miles of gathering lines getting put into urban areas, and then people in Pennsylvania and areas like that started bugging us about even more unregulated gathering lines in rural areas. And one of the statistics I heard not too long ago, and I think it was from one of the regulators of Pennsylvania, that in the last year, and I can't remember if that was last year or the year before, there was actually 10,000 new miles of pipeline put in the ground in Pennsylvania. And 9,200 of those miles were completely unregulated rural gathering lines. So that shows you kind of the extent of the amount of rural gathering lines going in the ground. Those unregulated gatherings, particularly in places like Pennsylvania, more so than what we saw in Texas anyway, some of them are of equal size, equal pressure as transmission pipelines, but the regulations on them are completely different. So we think that's a huge regulatory hole that needs to be fixed. And so we're having three speakers to talk about that this afternoon. The first one up is Don McCoy, who I've known for a number of years. I think we worked with him when we were first in Texas. And he's the Director of Pipeline Safety for Access Midstream, and he's going to explain what the industry is doing regarding gathering lines and how they're meeting best practices and regulations in many ways. And let's see, I've got it up. You're good to go, Don.
Thanks, Carl. Carl, thanks for inviting me. I think until I saw thousands of miles of gathering unregulated, really? Yeah. Well, what I want to talk about is, first I want to tell you that I'm not here to tell you whether gathering lines should be regulated or not. I think the federal government and the states will decide that. Secondly, I'm not here really representing Access Midstream. I'm now the senior advisor for pipeline safety for Access Midstream. What really is a group of us that are in the midstream business collaborated on this to put together our thoughts as to kind of defray some of what is out there about these lines being put in rampant with no oversight and no concern. Truly, gathering lines, the companies we work for, they're a long-term capital investment in assets and infrastructure. And the message there is, we're going to put those things in. We want them to last a long time, but we're going to do it right, and we're going to take care of them. And if there's no other message I'll leave you with today, take heart in that. A lot of the concerns I think that Linda may have, Carl may have with gathering is old stuff. The legacy stuff, we call it, built in the many years ago. But even then, think back and see how many serious incidents associated with those lines are out there. Those lines are typically low pressure, smaller lines. True, some of the lines we're putting in today are larger, but they're being done, we think, in the proper way. We've got a great opportunity in this country with these shale areas to become energy independent. We're already, I heard the other day, #1 in oil production, which I found hard to believe. We're building up a great reserve of natural gas. We're looking now to export natural gas rather than import natural gas. But that being said, we've got to do it in the proper way and be careful and be safe. We deserve it to the people that live around us and in our neighborhoods to do the right thing. And so, again, I want you to understand that we think we're trying to do the right thing moving forward. There are three phases. You all know the three phases of gas transportation. And understand that every stage is regulated in some aspect, not necessarily by DOT. You have your upstream, your exploration and production, your midstream, which is where your gathering falls. We take the product out of the ground, we treat it, we compress it, and we deliver it to the downstream transmission companies that carry it cross country and deliver it to you folks for your everyday use in your homes. Who oversees the safety of gathering lines? Well, the federal government ultimately starts the process. They have jurisdiction over all gathering lines, but some of those are exempted from the requirements found in Part 192. States, and many, as you'll see here, many states have gone over and above the federal government, which you all know that states can have regulations more stringent than 192, not less stringent. And states are looking at these lines and deciding, if and where they need to be more stringent and have regulations over and above. And we're seeing things like construction reporting, wanting additional corrosion control requirements, and certainly, and I think most of the companies out there doing this, putting their lines in damage prevention programs and including many of their assets in public awareness. As a company, we want to design, construct, test, and operate those gathering lines in a manner to safely transport the product and ensure the long-term integrity of our pipeline systems. It's a smart thing to do. If we're to promote the use of natural gas and these resources in this country, we don't want to have the negatives, the consequences that Carl talks about. You know, those are bad for our business. They're bad for everyone involved. Here are the states that you'll see in the reddish color that have some regulations over and above the federal requirements. We think these states do have some gathering or production, if you will. And for example, the state of Ohio is taking it upon themselves to go ahead and make all Class 1 gathering associated with hydraulic fracturing, the new stuff going in the ground, make it regulated. We're going to talk about class here in just a second. But it'll give you an idea that there are states out there that are active. And for the most part, most gathering lines are intrastate pipelines and would fall under the auspices of the state agency that works with PHMSA. Traditionally, in gathering lines have always been based on risk. The original rules that came out in 1970, it said, okay, if a gathering line is located in a city, town, village, populated area, such as a subdivision, that portion going through those would be regulated, associating the regulated with population density. With the gathering line rules changed in 2006, that was changed to say, okay, we will regulate, we being federal government, will say we'll regulate gathering lines in class locations 2, 3, and 4. But those, again, in the past, those have been historically smaller diameters, lower pressures than transmission pipelines. Class location, many of you are familiar with the term. If you're not, I know there's a lot of pipeline folks in the room, and this is old hat to them. Keep in mind that we keep hearing this risk-based concept. Bill Bird talked about it this morning. Class location has been a risk-based concept in 192 since 1970. PHMSA is even talking about changing and getting away from class location. I don't see how you will ever get away from a risk-based approach involving population, because that's where you're most concerned. But what it is basically is it takes a sliding mile of pipeline, you lay a 220-yard boundary, if you will, on either side, and the number of buildings intended for human occupancy inside that given mile establishes class location. And Class 1, which we further not regulating Class 1, there are 10 or fewer houses, if you will, or places for people to live inside that mile. Class 2 is between 10 and 46. Class 3, you get 46 or more homes, you're getting into your subdivisions. Also, Class 3 talks about where you have buildings that are public buildings or well-used buildings that have 20 or more people there for 10 weeks, you know, in a given period or whatever. So it does get closer as you go forward. Class 4 is where you have your downtown areas, buildings with four more stories prevalent. Most of your gathering is going to fall in Class 1 and Class 2. Very little gathering is in Class 4. Even in Fort Worth, where we have a large footprint, if you will, we only have one pipeline, and it was a pipeline we acquired that falls in a Class 4 location. So we're concerned with the Class 2 and Class 3, looking for areas that would qualify for Class 3. Because if you see those little numbers there, 72% MAOP, 60%, 50% MAOP, those are safety factors that we have to be concerned with in designing a pipeline for a class location. So why the current focus? You know, I've been in this business for a long time. In fact, when we were talking today about how much experience we would have in these gathering companies dealing with pipeline regulations, they said, oh, we've got about 50-something years of experience. I said, that's great. And then I realized 40 of it was me. You know? So the current focus, obviously, is when fracking, if you will, non-conventional shale drilling and production came into play, which incidentally happened after the latest rule change in bothering gathering. People started getting attention. Laying pipelines, again, in a populated area in Fort Worth, and thinking these things were being laid pell-mell with no oversight and no concern. Gave the public the perception that these lines aren't safe. And what are we going to do to make these safe? To make these lines safe, we've got to be sure they're regulated. Well, that may be something that comes down the road, but again, a prudent operator is not going to put junk in the ground. Keep that in mind. A lot of the consideration of what Carl just said is these newer gathering lines, these are at larger diameters and the same pressures as transmission lines. So I want to kind of assuage you a little bit on some of that. Looking at a chart, and we were asked by PHMSA, we the industry were asked by PHMSA a year or so ago to come up with some data, give us some reporting data on these these gathering lines in Class 1 location. So 45 companies reported about 120,000 miles in a Class 1 location. The Type A you see at the top, the regulations make a distinction between a Type A pipeline and a Type B pipeline as far as gathering is concerned, and Type A is your higher pressure, meaning that the maximum allowable operating pressure for that line would fall above 20% of the specified minimum yield strength, which I'm going to touch on that here in just a minute. But if you look at that chart, about from the 12 o'clock position around about 9 o'clock, it shows that 73% of the lines that were reported are 8 inches or less. And 8 inches is, a lot of 8-inch lines are in your distribution mains. You know, there's not a large percentage of the larger, the 16 to 24-inch pipelines that you see. And what about pipeline pressures? Well, Carl said he hated math, but Carl, we got to give you a little math here. The design formula for a steel pipe in 192, you design based on basically three parameters. The specified minimum yield strength, or what the code calls Smythe, in pounds per square inch. And that's a function of the steel you buy, the strength of it basically, the wall thickness of the pipe, and the nominal outside diameter. The factors you see at the top, the F, the E, and the T, F is the only one that really comes into play in today's world. The E and the T disappeared from many years ago. Those were a joint factor and a temperature factor. So the F factor is this class location design factor you saw previously. It says what basically, if you have a pipe, 100% of its designed to 100% of its yield value, then you automatically have to reduce that to 72% for Class 1 on down to 40% for Class 2. Many of your gathering companies now are actually designing all of their pipelines, regardless of class locations, for at least one class location more than what's out there. So not as much in 72%, quite a bit in 60% and 50%. So what is this term MAOP, or maximum allowable operating pressure? That's what the code says is the highest pressure to which an operator can legally operate that line in accordance with the regulations. And it's established by this formula, but also it's just a piece of the equation. You also have to look at the pressure ratings of the components you use in that pipeline, the valves and the fittings. And you establish that by hydrostatically testing that line using water to test that for a period of 8 hours or more. That will give you a MAOP value, and that's really how an operator kind of values his system, is I've established this MAOP of a certain amount, and down the road, if we need to sell it, then that's one of our selling points. But notice the bottom. It's very common for your operating pressures to be much, much lower than your MAOP for most of us in this business. And I'll give you an example. Let's take one of these larger pipelines that you think's out there, a 16-inch diameter pipeline, which has a 0.375-inch wall thickness, who has a Smythe value. It's an X65 pipe of 65,000, and I'm designing it for a Class 3 location, which means I'm using a safety factor of 0.5. That would yield me a pressure in that of 1,523 pounds, which would be 50% of its specified minimum yield strength. However, a real-world example, and I said Company X, but this is my company basically. This pipe is used on the upstream of what we call the suction side of compression. Now in gathering, the upstream side is where your gathering occurs. When you have a final stage of compression and you discharge that to your customer, to the transmission company, the discharge pressure will be higher and it will approximate or be close to those values that Carl mentioned, that is equivalent to a transmission company, because that's what pressure you have to get in their system. Even though we have a 1,523-pound design pressure, The components in this case that we're using, which are rated by what we call an ANSI series, American National Standards Institute, of 300, which is basically around 740. We're going to try to establish a MAOP for this line of 715 pounds, which means we will test it for 8 hours or more at 1,075 pounds. And we get that test pressure by taking a Class 3 factor of 1.5 times the desired MAOP of 715. Okay, if we establish that 715, notice that that comes out to a value of 23% of specified minimum yield, which is less than the 30% value that you see where most of the experts say a pipeline is most likely to rupture. Anything less than 30, if a pipeline is going to fail, it's likely to fail in a leak mode. Even so, we don't operate that line anywhere close to that. In talking to our folks in the area, this line typically operates around 150. And I put in here, typically operates at 2,000 pounds or less. Notice that would be, at 200 pounds would be 6% of its specified minimum yield. So you have a tremendous cushion, if you will, between what this line's operating at and what its perceived maximum allowable operating pressure would be. In today's world, take comfort in knowing that, these regulations have been out for 40-something years. There hadn't been a lot of changes in these regulations as far as technology, but there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot better than it was 40 years ago. We've got new pipes, we've got inline inspection, we've got better welding, we've got better coatings. We've got SCADA, We've got a lot of things out there in our favor, and we're using these to design these lines and be sure they're state of the art. We're also aware of what 192 says, and it would be foolish to not, if you're a prudent company like we think most of us are in this room, to use 192 to help us design. So we will meet those standards or exceed them for things like welding, how much cover we put on it, hydro testing those lines, and quality assurance. We even go beyond and think of some of the things that we thought were going to be required of us, again, like putting our lines in the one-call system, marking our lines like the code requires, putting cathodic protection on our lines like the code requires, putting these lines in public awareness, things that technically we would not be required to do on an unregulated line. We're doing it because it makes good business sense to do that. Then we monitor these lines for class location changes, so if we do have to make any adjustments, and perceived threats. A lot of talk about encroachments and concerns in building over pipelines. That is a perceived threat to us, people digging into our facilities. We heard talk about the farmers this morning. Real concern for us. We try to work with those people, work with the emergency responders. We're doing a very diligent effort, we think, in working with the public and working with organizations like Pipeline Safety Trust. Again, pipeline, looking forward, the folks I work for are always going to take steps to protect people, environment, and integrity of our system. Our CEO has what he calls the 000. He wants zero incidents, zero motor vehicle incidents, zero injuries, because he says he can't bear to look someone in the face that doesn't go home that night and is injured. We'd like, though, when PHMSA looks ahead and starts developing regulation on gathering lines, continue to use this risk-based approach. It makes most sense. You need to put your resources where they will do the most good. Looking at things like our biggest threats to our pipeline companies are damage prevention, corrosion. We're taking care of the corrosion, but we need help from a regulatory standpoint in looking at our risk-based approach. And one thing that would really help us, I don't know if we'll ever achieve it or not since we are in so many different states, is a consistent application of gathering line regulations. And if I could, I'd like to give you an example. As I said, we're intra-state, and we're all going through public awareness inspections right now. And Harold told you this morning that we have to, the states have to have theirs in by the end of this year. We went through 5 different states. The first 4 we were cited as having one of the best programs. Actually, the state of Texas said we had one of the best programs at public awareness they had reviewed so far. The 5th state we went into said, oh, this program's unsatisfactory. It's hard to understand why 4 states would think it's great and 1 state would find what we thought were minor problems with it. So consistency in application from an inspection standpoint is a big plus in our favor. In conclusion, we said this before, Pipelines are currently the safest means of transporting hazardous liquids and natural gas, and it's our role to keep it that way. Thank you very much.